Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so happy to introduce a very eminent guest. This is Professor William Rothstein. He is a professor of music theory at Queen's College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. And he has a very interesting book that I want to talk about today. It is The Musical Language of Italian Opera, 1813 to 1859, published by Oxford University Press. Professor Rothstein, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
So this is a book. This is a great book. We're all on this show all about Italians, all about Italian music, essentially, the pedagogy, the philosophy, the repertoire. So, of course, this book would intrigue, I think, myself and many people in my audience, and it's very interesting. So, I saw in another clip of yours where you mentioned that you actually didn't come to Italian opera immediately. You came a little bit later, but why don't we actually just begin with a little bit about your background, and you can share so the audience has some understanding about your training and where you come from.
Okay, great. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a medium-sized city in the American Midwest. Like so many people in music theory and musicology, I started by playing the piano. I was exposed to piano music and to symphonic music because I did go to some orchestra concerts, but really not to opera. It just wasn't on my radar screen. So I had a very traditional musical upbringing with a lot of Bach and Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven, heavily Germanic. Milwaukee was a rather German city culturally for a very, very long time. And I didn't really discover opera until undergraduate school, say in music history classes. I went to Northwestern University outside Chicago. And so I fell in love with Monteverdi, with Henry Purcell. There's Milwaukee. The first Italian opera I got to know at all was besides Monteverdi, was Verdi's La Traviata, which I fell in love with. But I didn't really get into, and so I started as a piano major at Northwestern, but then gravitated toward composition. I had started composing already in Milwaukee. And because I had really gotten sort of hooked on 20th century music, I was playing a lot of it. In fact, as a pianist, I was playing more 20th century music than anything else. And so I composed. I sort of never found an individual compositional voice, but I imitated sort of one 20th century composer after another. And then I went to New England Conservatory in Boston, and that was really the crucial move for me. I entered as a composition major, studied with Donald Martino, but I also ended up in a theory class taught by Ernst Oster, who was German and who was a pupil of Heinrich Schenker. And so I got into Schenkerian analysis. I also, for almost purely financial reasons, did a huge amount of accompanying, primarily instrumental, but also vocal, and I was the accompanist for the New England Conservatory Chorus. So, and then I went to Yale for a PhD. I figured out that my career path was going to be music theory, and went to Yale for a PhD. Alan Fort was my dissertation advisor. But again, I did a huge amount of accompanying. So I have accompanied, I think, the entire cello repertoire, a great deal of violin music, but I also ended up accompanying for the soprano Phyllis Curtin, her weekly studio class, and some of her students, individual lessons. So I learned a great deal of vocal repertoire. I started to learn about singing. I'm not a singer myself. I sing horribly. But partly, hello, there is Phyllis. She's passed away, unfortunately. Um, anyway, my training was very, very, very German oriented, and people in that tradition tend to look down their noses at Italian opera,
Mm.
especially 19th century Italian opera. So there was a prejudice there that was sort of in me that I had to get over. But I became a fan. I simply became a fan. I just really enjoyed listening to particularly Verdi and Bellini, those two especially. And then Rossini got added to the mix, and eventually Donizetti, etc., etc. This was in my sort of mid 20s. So from my mid 20s on, I became simply a big fan of Italian opera, started to go to the opera, started to come down from New Haven to New York to go to the Met. I finished my degree. So I just now retired from active teaching. I taught first.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I taught theory for 45 years. First at Amherst College in Massachusetts, then at the University of Michigan School of Music, then at the Oberlin College Conservatory, and for the last 25 years at Queens College in the Graduate Center of the City University of New York.
Phenomenal. Well, I think you're quite experienced, and you'll be a very good person to talk about this then. So maybe we should just jump right in. So I think so why did you come to select Italian opera for this book? And clearly you loved it and it was interesting. You mentioned in the Oxford University Press little clip there that you really had a twofold purpose, really, in sort of writing this book. It's to spread the love of this repertoire, especially for musicologists and music theorists. So maybe why don't you talk about the sort of purpose for writing this book?
Yes, I was writing for multiple audiences, but the principal audience was people in the North American music theory community
Hmm.
because they, as I did, imbibed this prejudice against Italian opera, from a young
Hmm.
age. I managed to get over it and I love the stuff. And so I want other people to get over it too. There's just this very pro German thing. So that to the extent that people study vocal music, it's a German leader. It's Schubert and Schumann and Hugo Wolf. Um, and to the extent that theorists study opera, it tends to be Mozart or Wagner. Um, so, um, hoping to help my fellow theorists, especially ones younger than myself, get over this prejudice and to just spread the love of this repertoire was number one. Then, secondly, there is, particularly in recent decades, not a terribly strong tradition of treating Italian Romantic opera seriously from an analytical viewpoint. So those who are fans tend not to intellectualize about it, and those who intellectualize about music tend not to gravitate toward this repertoire. I would love to help close that gap a bit. Then there was also the fact that there was a period in the late 20th century where there was some wonderful analytical work on this repertoire going on, but none of it was by people who self-identified as music theorists. It was all by people who self-identified as musicologists. And I mean people like Harold Powers, Stephen Huebner, Phil Gossett. Some of these people are no longer with us. Huebner is alive and well. In fact, I'll be seeing him in a few weeks in Montreal and giving a talk up there at the beginning of April. So theorists don't know these writings because there's just so much, insularity in these various professions. So theorists tend not to read writings by musicologists, even when they are analytical, and to some degree, they're the reverse.
Hmm. And you mentioned that there were some German theorists or people who wrote textbooks like, for instance, Schenker or Schoenberg or I think it was not Walter Piss. I forget. There was another one, Hindemith. So German significant composers and theorists and teachers who were not they really downplayed Italian influence. And could you, in a brief, why was that the case? Why were they so down on them?
Well, I mean, German nationalism from the 19th century onward is just a huge thing. There's the quotation from the poet Friedrich Schiller that each nation has its hour in the sun, but the hour of the German is the harvest of all time. And that pretty much summarizes the outlook of people like Schoenberg and
Isn't Schiller the poet for the Symphony 9? Isn't he the poet? Oh, okay.
Yes.
And they love Beethoven, so he's going to go.
Yes.
So
it was, when Schoenberg developed the 12-tone system, he wrote a letter, I forget to whom, triumphantly saying, "I have ensured the supremacy of German music for the next 100 years." And Schenker felt that Italian music, of, say, the Baroque was very important. But once Bach and Haydn and those German composers came along, the day of the Italians, that was over. And, the Germans ruled the musical roost from then on. He also had a certain prejudice against opera in general, stronger and stronger as he went on, which is strange because he actually loved he loved listening to certain operas, including some operas not by Germans, but whatever. It's just a question of a German nationalism. Paul Hindemith, who was extremely influential, along with Schoenberg and Schenker, in the development of the music theory profession in the United States, he felt that his American-born students had terrible musical educations. They were not talented. He had one or two European-born students here, like the composer Lucas Voss, and he thought they were superior. So in any case, the attitudes of these people like Schenker, who was never in America, but his pupils were, Schenker and Schoenberg and Hindemith, really saturated the development of American music theory, starting, when some of those people came here fleeing Hitler in the 30s and early 40s. On the other side of a certain divide, you had the Boulanger school, who tended to be composers teaching in conservatories, not so academic. It's only, that existed, but academic music theory didn't really take much notice of the Boulanger school. A huge breakthrough, of course, and I know you've interviewed Robert Yerningen more than once, his book on music in the galant style, which showed that the Paris Conservatory tradition, the Boulanger tradition, comes from this Italian galant tradition, and that expanded the purview of that tradition, I think, for an American audience beyond the seemingly sort of peripheral domain of, late Romantic, early modern French music. A composer like Gabriel Fauré. Fauré is wonderful, but has never been considered, in a certain sense, completely mainstream. So, but in any case, since Appartamento and schema theory has gotten on the map, starting primarily with Yerningen in this country, that has really entered the mainstream. Speaking for myself as someone older, I wish that had happened 20 or 30 years earlier.
Can I just have a little tangent? You're a music theorist now. Are you primarily like a Schenkerian or a Riemannian or a set? I mean, what if you could describe yourself? What sort of school do you belong to?
Well, I certainly started out as a Schenkerian. I entered the field through studying Schenkerian analysis with Ernst Oster, who's best known as the translator of Schenker's last book, Free Composition. He didn't publish a lot other than that. And so, I mean, I would not be in this field if it were not for him, because when I was, say, an undergraduate, I was good at music theory, but I thought it was boring and not really relevant for musicians. I actually started studying music theory at the age of 12, studying Walter Piston's harmony book, which again, I could rattle off Roman numerals with the best of them, and I didn't see much use in it. So I very much started out as a Schenker adherent, but became kind of more and more wide-ranging, more and more eclectic as the years went on. Partly through becoming increasingly steeped in the history of music theory, which I taught at the graduate level at CUNY for quite a few years. And understanding the historical development of thinking about music theory really helped to broaden my horizons. So although Schenker is still very, very important in the way I think about music, I've broadened out a bit. I broadened out a great deal. One thing that was just completely fortuitous, again, this was at New England Conservatory. While I was studying Schenker analysis with Ernst Oster, I was simultaneously studying continuo realization with the composer Daniel Pinkham, who taught a course, was called Baroque music, but was really continuo realization. And for example, we, toward the end of the course, we played some of the two keyboard sonatas of Bernardo Pasquini, who was one of the founders of the Partimento tradition. Although no one ever said the word Partimento, I wouldn't have known what it meant. And so I made a connection in my own mind between what Schenker did and thorough bass, or basso continuo, because basso continuo was actually very important in Schenkerian analysis. And since getting to know more about Partimento and more recently solfeggio, thanks to Nick Baraguanov, the connections with Schenkerian analysis are just, to me, so obvious.
Yeah. So now I want to talk about the book now, and we can dive more into the book, because it's a very how much is 20 years in the making or something, or was how long would you say the book has been something in your mind that you wanted to write?
Well, I began really analyzing 19th century Italian opera seriously, and in other words, turning from being just a fan to a scholar right at the turn of the century. I taught a course on opera. It wasn't just Italian, but on opera in the year 2000, a graduate seminar, and that sort of started things off. In fact, I remember I was on jury duty during the summer of 2000, and there's a lot of waiting when you're on jury duty. And I had a score of the Barber of Seville with me, and I was studying Barber of Seville while I was, sitting around and waiting for things to happen. Anyway, I first published an article in 2008, and I began writing the book in 2014. I'd hoped to write a book, starting perhaps around 2008. It wasn't until 2014 that I got a sabbatical, which gave me the opportunity to begin writing the book. And so I wrote the book between 2014 and about 2020. After that initial sabbatical, it was mostly during the summers, which is
So
why it took
now,
so long.
so it heavily deals with extensive music analysis, and you actually make a note. You say that actually that's less on the non-musical aspects of opera. So why did you make this editorial decision then?
There are scholars much more qualified than I who have been and are writing about non-musical aspects of opera. I wanted to write about what I could offer that might be what someone else could not.
So looking at the music then, so let's take a big view now. What can we see about the influences of 19th century opera? Are they, now this is the 19th century, after the French Revolution and the other, Italy not as, I guess, not as prominent, but were the influences on 19th century opera continental, or would you say they're actually still very much Italian?
They're still very much Italian. Outside influences increase as the century progresses. Now, it is important to contrast Naples and southern Italy on the one hand with Milan and Bologna, etc., and northern Italy on the other. Outside influence much stronger in the north, as one might expect. So Naples continues to be very much its own school, and feeling, even in the early 19th century, like it was the center of the musical universe, which perhaps was no longer entirely true, but they thought so. Certainly in Naples, the old tradition continues very, very strongly. In the north, it continues, but there is more French influence, courtesy of Napoleon, partly. As the century progresses, what German influence comes in is mostly a Meyerbeer. There is a certain amount of Haydn and Mozart. It's easy, I think, to exaggerate the influence of Haydn and Mozart, particularly in the early part of the century. Mozart's instrumental music, particularly his string quartets and quintets, we know that Verdi studied them. We know that Bellini studied them. Mozart's operas, I think, were a little less influential at the beginning. But the sort of Germanic school, which had mostly to do, as far as the Italians were concerned, with harmony and orchestration, this came through primarily through Giacomo Meyerbeer, who was not not given the attention he deserves. His stock fell sharply around World War I. So when German influence becomes a big thing during the later period of Donizetti, the Reform operas of Mercadante, and certainly Verdi, by German, we really mean Meyerbeer. Mm-hmm. We certainly don't mean Beethoven. We don't mean Beethoven. We don't mean Schubert. We don't mean Schumann. We don't mean Wagner.
Right.
Until much later.
Right. So you talk about recurring principles, and you talk about you draw from things as early as the 16th century in your analyses. So first of all, these principles, what are they, and can you say they are Italian?
Well, I'll get to the 16th century because that has to do with a very special case. I'll put that to the side for a moment. Certainly the teaching of harmony through thorough bass, through partimento, extremely important in Italy, both south and north. Also in Austria, there's of course a strong connection, partly for political reasons, between Austria and the north of Italy, which Austria ruled for a long time. So there is that. There is the tradition of vocal improvisation, vocal diminution, which is terribly important. And actually, one of the ways, this is going back a little bit, one of the ways I sort of backed into being a scholar of Italian opera was through being a scholar of the music of Chopin. And partly through some lectures by the conductor Will Crutchfield, who's a specialist in bel canto opera, I came to understand the connection between bel canto opera and the music of Chopin. In fact, in 2013, Crutchfield published an absolutely revelatory article in Italian on the castrato Velluti and the influence of Velluti's improvisation, his style of vocal ornament on the music of the bel canto composers and on Chopin. That's so far only been published in Italian, but being a Chopin scholar, I published a fair amount on Chopin in the 90s, also helped me become a bel canto scholar.
And Chopin, we know he loved Italian opera.
Chopin loved Italian opera, particularly Rossini in his early years. Later, in Paris, he got to know Bellini and loved Bellini. There was a northern Italian composer named Soliva, Soliva. He was actually the composer most strongly influenced by Mozart's operas. He was a pupil of Bonifacio Ascioli at the Milan Conservatory. And if you want to hear Mozart influence in Italian opera, don't listen to Rossini, listen to Soliva. I mean, he's basically forgotten. But if you read the writings of Stendhal, his book, Rome, Naples, and Florence, he comes to Milan, Stendhal does, in 1816 after the Napoleonic Wars, goes back to his beloved La Scala, and the first opera he hears is Soliva's La Testa di Bronzo, which he's absolutely in raptures about. And if you listen to La Testa di Bronzo, it is Mozart.
Wow. Fantastic. So let's keep going now. You mentioned Rossini. Why don't we start with Rossini then? So you actually have, is it 5 composers that you spotlight for your book?
I spotlight Rossini and Verdi more than anyone else, but also Bellini, Donizetti, Mercadante, and a chapter on Meyerbeer because he was so influential on the later Italians that I felt I had to include him.
So let's begin with Rossini now. So I from what I know, I think he studied a little bit with Mattei, but then he needed to go and conquer the world to make some money, and he was astoundingly successful. So tell me a little bit from your research, what you figured from Rossini's operas.
There is a strong classical strain in Rossini that, for example, with very few exceptions, he would write these very large numbers, as they're called, whether it's an aria or an ensemble, in multiple movements. With very few exceptions, he will begin and end these sometimes very long numbers in the same key. And that's a kind of classicism. His later Italian composers break away from that, and unity of key becomes much less central as a sort of aesthetic requirement. Quite famously, Rossini wrote out a lot of his vocal ornamentation, though he still expected singers to supply their own. Obviously, toward the end of his career, he's in Paris. He writes William Tell, Guillaume Tell. I have an entire chapter on Guillaume Tell. But I do contrast this sort of neoclassical side of Rossini with the more full-bloodedly romantic composers who follow him, like Bellini and Donizetti.
How much of Rossini is Haydn and Mozart? Because I think there are anecdotes where he says he was really influenced by these two Germanic composers.
Well, toward the end of his life, and I think this is mostly in his famous interview with Wagner, which is really toward the end of his life, so many decades after he'd stopped composing, he speaks about his worship of Mozart. I'm not an expert on the history of very early Rossini, but to the best of my knowledge, he knew the instrumental music of Mozart. Again, things like the quartets, the quintets, perhaps the symphonies. He had studied those in Bologna as a teenager. Mozart's operas were not really performed in the north of Italy, except for a very short window right after the Austrians resumed control after the Napoleonic Wars. So there's what one Italian musicologist calls a Mozart boom in 1816. Don Giovanni was done in 1814, but the 1816 season was the height of it. Now, by 1816, Rossini is already a fairly mature composer, and he isn't even in the north anymore. He's living in Naples. So I think it is, as far as Haydn, we do know that the young Rossini conducted a performance of Haydn's oratorio, The Seasons. And Bonifacio Ascioli, who was the head of the Milan Conservatory until the Austrians kicked him out when they took over again in 1814. Ascioli was a great lover of Haydn's oratorios and Mozart in general. He was influential in bringing Haydn and Mozart to Italy. He corresponded with Haydn. He actually was the teacher of Mozart's son. Haydn recommended that Mozart's son study with him. But as far as Rossini himself, I think that Cimarosa and Paisiello are more important than Haydn and Mozart. Cimarosa and Paisiello were considered sort of the gods of late 18th century Italian opera. They were perhaps worshipped more than they were performed after the end of the Napoleonic period. But I've looked at a little bit of Ascioli's music. It's very similar to Paisiello. Ascioli's theoretical writings, particularly his writings on rhythm, they really seem to be describing Paisiello's music more than anybody else's.
Okay, so this is confusing because we were separating Germans, Italians, but I mean, I feel like maybe we should mention Haydn and Mozart themselves. Isn't there a strong Italian sort of core to their music that really, if we call them Germans, yes, they are by ethnicity or nationality, but I mean, Haydn worked with Porpora as an accompanist and studied composition with him. Mozart extensively toured Italy and worked with many Italians. So is it all just Italian, or is there something German that we can identify there?
Well, let me pick this apart a bit. Mozart spent some very important early time in Italy, studying with Padre Martini, writing operas for Italy. He spoke Italian well. He was strongly influenced by Johann Christian Bach, who was himself strongly Italianate. So there's a very strong Italian connection with Mozart. Now, the Italians didn't consider Mozart Italian, not by a long shot. He was German. The Italian connection is actually weaker with Haydn. He did have that very important early experience with Porpora, as you mentioned, which was apparently eye-opening. He never went to Italy. I have an article coming out on text setting in Mozart, Haydn, Paisiello, and Cimarosa. And Haydn's Italian text setting is not as idiomatic as Mozart's. So I think he was less steeped in Italian music, and sort of, as I say, he said Italian less idiomatically.
Okay. Now, so Rossini, I would actually love to know, because as you were saying, there was a very strong German interest in German music. Did the Italians have an appreciable influence in German music? Did the Germans, I'm talking about the Germans in the 19th century, did they listen to Italian opera and take things, and did it influence German music?
Not as much as in previous centuries. Schumann writes in one of his reviews about standing in a music shop paging through Bellini. And he doesn't have terribly nice things to say about Bellini. He definitely has that German superiority complex toward the Italians. On the other hand, I think it is not too difficult to discern some Italian influence in some of Schumann's early piano music. And in fact, there's a very good article, a few decades old now, by an American theorist named Peter Kaminsky, about Schumann's early piano cycles. He doesn't draw the Italian connection, but he speaks, for example, of how in Schumann's Davidsbündlertänze Opus 6, the keys shift back and forth, particularly between G major and either B major or B minor, focusing on the melodic note B as the sort of hinge on which these shifting keys shift. And that is actually very Italian. Schumann writes that, he was looking through Bellini and he says, I think I have drained all the honey from them, that I needed. So I think there is a bit of Bellini in Schumann.
Right.
But by the 19th century, the Germans are really feeling their oats, so to speak, and feel that they are the leading musical nation in Europe. Italian influence is stronger in Vienna than in, say Berlin, for sure. Berlin tended to look toward France. Vienna was always a Milan axis in particular. So in terms of pedagogical methods, you can see a strong Italian influence in Austria. When I used to teach 18th century counterpoint, I used a method by the Viennese theorist Johann Georg Albrechtsberger, who was Beethoven's teacher. And so Albrechtsberger had a fascinating pedagogical method. He would teach species counterpoint in the manner of Johann Joseph Fuchs, the Gradus ad Parnassum, and then he would teach species counterpoint a second time using sort of 18th century harmonic language, including dominant seventh chords and augmented sixth chords and what have you, a sort of up-to-date harmonic language. And so I used to teach Albrechtsberger's method. And figured bass, figured, no pun intended, extremely prominently. And I'm just have always been, since that study with Daniel Pinkham, a huge advocate of the importance of thorough bass. I find it much more useful than slapping Roman numerals onto music.
Just a quick tangent. So all that accompaniment training and performance you did, I'm curious, like playing chords, getting really hands-on playing chords of the piano, accompanying different instruments. Is that valuable for a pianist's education? I know nowadays pianists love to play virtuosic repertoire and it's a lot of solo, and they tend to neglect chamber playing. And is there a dimension that they're missing if they neglect chamber playing?
Oh, heavens, yes. On the other hand, I understand the pressure to specialize. So if you can burn up the keyboard with Liszt, you want to impress people with that. Well, that tends to be what you do. But yes, chamber music definitely adds a dimension an important dimension to one's understanding of music, and accompanying singers does as well. Um, to learn how singers breathe is very important.
Yeah. And does that also, you're a composer. Do you notice, are there little things about that also help you if you, because I guess I read an anecdote that Mendelssohn accompanied somebody like a god, as Schumann said, or something. And I feel like all these great composers are quite well rounded. They can kind of jump into any setting. And does that help perhaps in composition or music theory as well? Do you get to see?
Well, I stopped composing at the age of 21. I realized that was not what I was cut out for. So I won't really, and I composed in those days very up-to-date styles, very sort of late 20th century styles. So I won't speak to that. But in terms of theory, of understanding music from the inside, certainly, composing counterpoint is extremely important, and learning to hear multiple voices and being able to hear multiple voices without sounding them on an instrument. To be able to conceptualize music, to hear music mentally the way a conductor does when studying the score. I can't overemphasize the importance of that skill. And to understand harmony through the fingers, as in thorough bass or basso continuo, call it what you will, also I think is tremendously important.
So, Professor Rothstein, I know you're extensively trained in accompaniment. Sight reading is something I'm very interested in. I think it's such an important thing. So can you speak on sight reading and its importance, how to get good at it? So just the topic in general.
How to get good at it is a difficult topic. I've always just been good at it. So I started accompanying when I was still in high school. I remember the very first piece I accompanied was a Hindemith viola sonata. And when I was a student in college and graduate school, I did huge amounts of accompanying, and I tended to be hired because I could sight read very well, and I learned pieces very fast. And when I did accompanying for voice lessons, I just had to read whatever was in front of me. There was a teacher at New England Conservatory, a voice teacher named Ray DeVoe. He's no longer living. And he taught a lot of Fauré songs. And sight reading Fauré is hard. But you just had to do it. And I was hired as accompanist for the New England Conservatory chorus because I could sight read choral scores. And I don't exactly know how I did it or do it, except that I've always been good at audiating. I can look at a score and hear it in my head, and I've always been able to do that. I've never not been able to do that.
Is that like a perfect pitch thing though?
It is partly a perfect pitch thing. I do have perfect pitch.
Yeah.
People can audiate scores with only relative pitch. It might not be at the exact pitch level, and it doesn't matter a bit. I do happen to have perfect pitch. So sight reading is kind of a mystery to me. I've just always done it.
Have you done a lot of it? Massive quantities of it in your life? Massive quantities.
When I would want to, figure out, okay, what's the next piece I want to work on as a pianist when I don't practice anymore. When I was still practicing, I'd go to the music library, take scores down off the shelf, open them up and listen to them, audiate them, and decide, which piece I wanted to play next.
Wow. What about you said choral score? So that involves score reduction then as well? Is that
sort of? Yeah. So reading four staves.
Yeah.
And now certainly in those days it was modern score with just treble and bass clef. Reading it in four clefs is much more difficult and something I had to train myself to do later.
So just do it. So essentially, it's just do lots of it.
That's the thing. And when you're in a voice lesson and the singer is singing, being forced to not stop. That is so important. You
Mm.
just have to keep playing. You cannot stop because it's not about you, it's about the singer.
Yeah.
And so, maybe the most important thing in training to sight read is just to keep doing it without allowing yourself to stop.
So we talked about Rossini. Let's talk about perhaps Donizetti. So what do you dedicate your chapter? What do you speak about in your chapter on Donizetti?
I have a chapter on Donizetti and Mercadante focusing on one little period of just a few years of the late 1830s and early 1840s, when both of them were responding to the music of Meyerbeer. Now, Donizetti himself had already gone in individual directions in terms of musical dramaturgy, so slightly away from, you might say, pure bel canto to a kind of, letting the music reflect the dramatic situation more, and choosing libretti with, really violent emotions. So Donizetti had already been doing this, say, from the time of his Lucrezia Borgia, which is 1833, which is already moving toward this sort of very sort of full-blooded style, where the requirements of the drama are occasionally allowed to override purely traditional musical elements. But this intensifies as he gains experience in Paris. Paris was so important to the Italian composers. They tended to go there, first of all, because it was considered the musical and artistic capital of Europe. It paid a whole lot better than the Italians did, so they could make some money. But it really influenced their style. And so the later works of Donizetti and the so-called reform operas of Mercadante are hugely important to the young Verdi. And of course, Verdi is the main topic of the last part of my book. So I focus mostly on on a couple of Donizetti's late operas. One, La Favorite, one of his French grand operas in the manner of Meyerbeer. So I have analysis of the last act of that. And then his very last opera for Italy called Maria di Rohan, which is from 1843, actually written originally for Vienna, but in Italian, and really goes beyond the bel canto tradition in some very important ways. The last act in particular really sounds a lot like early Verdi. It ends in this sort of spectacular way where it's completely driven by the drama and not by the music.
So since you were targeting music theorists and young music scholars, there's a bias, I suppose, that Italian music is light, it's not serious, it doesn't have the intellectual rigor, the craftsmanship of German, like Johann Sebastian Bach, and there's the intricate. So is that true? Are the Italians not serious craftsmen? Do they have skill in their craft? I mean, writing tunes, that's one thing, but we're talking about just, craft, like really like seriousness. Were they serious musicians?
They certainly were. Both Rossini and Verdi in particular, their teachers who were very much in the Italian tradition. So we're talking about Padre Mattei for Rossini and Vincenzo Lavigna for Verdi. It was fugue and fugue and fugue and fugue till it was running out their ears. Now, there was an Italian tradition of teaching fugue, which was a bit different from the German, but we don't have to get into that. So yes, craft was very important. These people tended to write a lot of church music in their student years, following old traditions of counterpoint. Now, craft in the theater is a bit different. So some of the things that I think theorists tend to object to in, say, the bel canto repertoire, the simplicity of the accompaniments anytime an accompaniment seems to be going pa pa, a lot of my theorist colleagues are, out the door. And I said, pa pa is a very important pattern when the voice is what's supposed to be in the spotlight. So yeah, there's definitely that. So it's a different craft from that of writing string quartets.
Okay, so you mentioned Bellini. Let's talk about Bellini then. So, very successful, short-lived too, unfortunately. Didn't live a long life, but also hugely successful while he was alive. Talk a little bit about Bellini.
Bellini is very, very close to my heart. So he was a Southerner. He was from Sicily. He was Neapolitan trained, and the Neapolitans saw him as sort of the savior of the Neapolitan tradition against these northern interlopers like Rossini. Even though Rossini had spent an important part of his career in Naples. But anyway, because of the purity of Bellini's style, which is most pronounced in some of his earlier operas, such as La Straniera or I Capuletti e Montecchi. So there's this purity of melodic style, which audiences and connoisseurs instantly associated with Paisiello in particular. Paisiello's style became very refined and kind of simple and pure toward the end of his career. And so an opera like Bellini's La Sonnambula owes a huge amount to an opera called Nina by Paisiello. They're in fact, even in their stories, rather parallel. So since this old tradition of Paisiello and Cimarosa was understood to be kind of lost, Bellini was looked at, especially when he was young, as a kind of savior. Later on, he's more influenced by Rossini. The vocal lines become more ornate. And in what tends to be understood as his greatest opera, which is a Norma, he kind of fuses these traditions, the sort of serious, and I can't think of a better word than pure, even though that's very loaded. But there's that aspect of it, and there's the more, virtuosic strain that comes more from Rossini. And it has this wonderful balance in Norma, which is one of my very, very favorite operas in the whole world.
Let's now turn to Verdi. You mentioned him as well numerous times, and I think for the people who listen to my show, they know that he's sort of a grandchild of Fenaroli in a way, that he studied with Vincenzo Lavigna. So maybe why don't you talk a little bit about Verdi? You dedicate a chapter to him and his training and his influence, especially.
Yeah, happy to. So Verdi was from the north, from a small town in the Duchy of Parma, and was a kind of a late bloomer by the standards of those days. So when he applies to the Milan Conservatory at the age of 18, he's rejected for being too old. 18 is too late to start.
Wow.
So he studied, that's of course the age at which, American undergraduates
begin.
Yes. So he was too old. So he studies privately with Vincenzo Lavigna, who is getting on in years, had been the sort of accompanist, the maestro concertatore at La Scala, and had been a pupil of Fenaroli. So put Verdi through his paces in a very traditional way. Again, Lavigna. So a counterpoint, Partimento, the works, and a lot of fugue. But also, Lavigna, like Bonifacio Ascioli, was a great lover of Mozart's operas. So Lavigna had been involved in those Milan performances of Don Giovanni in the Mozart boom of 1816 and was very enamored of Don Giovanni. So Verdi studied Don Giovanni backward, forward, and sideways. Oh. And it actually shows in Verdi more than it does in Rossini. So there's that training. Verdi was also a kind of man of the theater and interested in drama, as literature, to a greater degree than most of the other Italians. And so expressing the drama was more central to him than it was to, say, Rossini. So Verdi also has this immensely long career, which clearly divides into kind of multiple phases. Plus, he was always concerned with sort of keeping up with musical developments. So he has all of these stylistic changes. So there's the early Verdi up until the time he spends 2 years in Paris, 1847 to 49, which is very important. So the early Verdi takes a lot after Donizetti and after Mercadante. The operas, and this is partly through his sense of what works in the theater. His operas are short. It's the real thing in early Verdi about brevity. So they move fast. They tend to be highly dramatic. They make heavy use of this newfangled thing called the baritone. Baritones were the rage in the 1840s. So
really? Okay.
Baritone voice, yes. That's partly thanks to Donizetti, and partly just, developments in Italian singing, where the baritone becomes a specialized voice. So you get these leading baritone characters. That really hadn't existed before. In Rossini, you tend to have lots of tenors. Right. But so there's a kind of breakthrough opera for Verdi called Macbeth after Shakespeare. This is 1847. He writes it for Florence, which is sort of has the most intellectual audience in Italy. So Verdi thinks that this opera on Shakespeare, which is novel in all sorts of interesting ways, that the Florentines would get it better than certain other audiences. And then he spends 2 years in Paris. He attends the premiere of Meyerbeer's Les Prophètes in 1849. He comes back, and this series of absolutely classic middle period Verdi operas arises, namely Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, and La Traviata, sometimes known collectively as the Romantic Trilogy, though that's certainly not anything Verdi ever called it. And that's sort of still the center of the Verdi repertoire in opera houses today. Then there's more experience with Paris. His productivity slows down. He announces his retirement after Un ballo in Mascara, 1859. Heavily French influenced. There's even a passage that sounds a lot like Offenbach. It's in the finale to Act One. An opera it's about the assassination of the King of Sweden, Gustav III of Sweden, in 1792. That Swedish court was heavily French influenced. In any case, for various reasons, it's a somewhat French opera, although it is in Italian and still Italian in many musical ways. In any case, after that, Verdi announces, "I'm done. I've worked, I'm
retired.
I've looked like a dog for 16 years. I'm going to be, I'm going to do what I want now." He has his farm. He becomes a gentleman farmer. Italy becomes a united nation. Verdi becomes a senator. He's in the Italian Senate. And then after that, he just writes operas when he wants to. So there's very few operas after Ballo. He writes La Forza del Destino for St. Petersburg because they pay him extremely well. He writes Don Carlos for Paris, and then Aida for the opening of the Suez Canal, for it's premiered in Cairo. And then at the very, very end, he writes Otello and Falstaff, which are very different from anything he had done before, and really show him, as I say, being up to date, being current with what was going on.
What are the key points of Italian opera in terms of a musical language that really kind of sum it up? Well, especially of this period, I guess.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there are the forms. The forms that really are codified above all by Rossini. And by this, I mean what the Florentine critic Abramo Bassevi calls the usual form, la solita forma. La solita forma dei duetti. He writes about it in the context of duets, which are very important. But in any case, so you have an introductory movement that Bassevi calls a tempo d'attacco. You have a slow movement, the adagio. You have a middle movement, a tempo di mezzo. You have a final fast movement, a cabaletta. This has absolutely nothing to do with, say, sonatas and symphonies, multi-movement. This is a distinctly Italian tradition. And so that continues with various modifications through till rather late in the century. So the Italian forms are very distinctive, and they continue in a rather traditional way till quite late in the century, till, say, the time of Puccini. So you have the multi-movement form of the introductory movement, tempo d'attacco, the adagio or slow movement, the lyrical outpouring, a transitional tempo di mezzo, which simply means middle tempo, and the cabaletta or a stretta, the final fast movement. So this is a very distinctive Italian form for the 19th century. You have a certain type of small form, which nowadays scholars tend to call a lyric form, for individual movements, particularly for the slow movement and the cabaletta. This is most prevalent in, say, the 1830s and 1840s, but it's increasingly modified, but you still see its influence later. So all of this has nothing to do with the German forms, with sonata form. Sonata form was not such a big deal in Italy. So there's very much that. There is the primacy of the outer voice, the counterpoint between melody and bass, with the bass as a kind of second melody. This grows out of partimento and solfeggio. This comes out of the 18th century. And this is central to Schenker's theory as well, I think, rather coincidentally, but there it is. And simply the primacy of the voice, the primacy of melody, the primacy of the voice. You see it in the music of Chopin, who was sort of equally influenced by the Italians and the Germans, meaning especially Bach and Mozart.
Now, with the music theorists are obsessed with chords and harmony and romantic sort of chords, what's the harmonic language of this period of Italian opera?
In the early part of the period, it is relatively simple, growing out of the style of the late 18th century. There are interesting complications in Rossini in particular. A lot of unexpected harmonic shifts by third. There's a chapter in my book on Rossini's mediant chords and the use of third-related keys. Later, under the influence primarily of Meyerbeer, there is a more chromatic language that develops. So from the 1840s onward, or maybe the late 1830s on. And that is, as I say, has a lot to do with the influence of Meyerbeer, who was a pupil of a man named Vogler, who was also the teacher of our Carl Maria von Weber. Vogler had an Italian connection. He was a student of a somewhat eccentric Italian theorist named Valotti in Padua. Yes, the Abbé Vogler. But I won't get too much into that. I'm a history of theory nerd, and I could go on for hours.
That's great. No, we enjoy that on this show. So we talked about harmony, we talked about melody. How about rhythm? Is there anything interesting about the rhythmic aspect of Italian opera?
Absolutely. Rhythm is actually one of my scholarly specialties. My first book was called Phrase, Rhythm, and Tonal Music. And that was very much, that was dealing entirely with instrumental music and exclusively with German instrumental music, which is the music I was brought up on. And I had a sense of how 18th and 19th century German instrumental music works rhythmically that derived a lot from the work of Schenker and others, but Schenker primarily. And when I began seriously studying Italian opera, especially Verdi, in the early 2000s, I realized that it really was working differently in the rhythmic domain. That the sense of where phrases go, where the strong and weak beats of the meter fall in relation to phrase beginnings and phrase endings was quite different. And I eventually, through studying the sources, realized that Verdi's particular use of rhythm in his, say, early to middle works came about through his study of the writings of Bonifacio Alcioli, who wrote very interestingly and specifically about rhythm in relation to phrases, in relation to Italian poetry, which syllables of the line go where in terms of the meter, in terms of the bar lines. And so in this Italian tradition, musical phrases come to their strongest accent at the end. Whereas in the German tradition, there was a German musicologist named Schmidt, died a few years ago, studied this issue of German text setting versus Italian text setting, and he put it very succinctly. He said, when in setting German, you put the strong musical accent on the first accented syllable of the line, and the rest of the line falls where it will. In Italian, you set the strongest musical accent to the last accented syllable in the line, and everything earlier falls where it will. And that is basically correct. Of course, it varies by historical epoch. But in the 19th century, that is basically correct.
Did you want to mention that 16th century influence that you were
yes.
talking about?
Influence might be going a bit far, though I'm not sure it was. The opening chapter of my Italian opera book is on one piece by Verdi, the so-called Anvil Chorus from Il Trovatore. It opens the second act. It became very famous. It is a very, very strange piece. And if you've heard it a lot, you might not appreciate just how strange it is. So it begins in one key and ends in another. It begins in E minor and ends in C major. There's a lot of G major along the way. There's a bit of A minor. And in thinking about the piece, I took the melody by itself. And this is something that I think is also kind of significant in the Italian tradition, something you can get through studying, say, Baragwanath's writings as well. The melody by itself. So what I found when I was studying the melody by itself is that, can you hear my keyboard? Yeah. So I have a melodic reduction of the piece a little bit similar to some of the reductions in Burkhart solfeggio book, or even in his earlier book, The Italian Traditions in Puccini. And when I took the main notes of the melody, that's an E, I got something like this. And that's the end. And so it starts here, it ends there, the E an octave above, it emphasizes B, and ends G, F natural, E. And I'm going, my God, it's the Phrygian mode. And insofar as there is a thread that holds that piece together, it's in the melody. It's not in the bass line. It has nothing to do with key. It's mode. So the piece is in effect in Phrygian. And that's where the 16th century comes in. So of course, in the Italian tradition, and this, especially you read this in Burkhart, new, it's not quite new anymore, the solfeggio book, plain chant, canto fermo, was something they were brought up on. How much Verdi himself studied canto fermo, I actually don't know. So whether Verdi was self-consciously writing a piece in Phrygian, I cannot swear to it. But that's the way it came out.
It's been a fantastic hour, Professor Rothstein. So the book is The Musical Language of Italian Opera, 1813 to 1859. The obvious question is, when's the sequel, 1860 onwards, coming out?
Well, I deliberately, I really thought very hard about where to end the book. I really, really wanted to end it before there was any influence of Wagner in Italy. The first performance of Wagner in Italy was in 1870. So, and I sort of wanted to include La Forza del Destino because I'd already published an article on it. But then I realized, no, Ballo, 1859 was the perfect place to end it because he retired. That's when he retired. He felt his career was over. So that was the perfect place to end it. But I especially, because the Wagner influence becomes very strong in the late part of the century. And I wanted a really Italian book.
Right. So to wrap up, why don't you leave with a concluding thought for people who are going to buy the book? And it's really been a terrific conversation. So I'll leave the floor to you, Professor Rothstein, for the final comment.
Thank you. If you don't have a lot of technical training in music theory, don't worry too much. Skip around in the book. Don't read it in order. Read the parts that most interest you. Flip to the index look at the list of operas and read about your favorite operas by all means. The first part of the book is more general. The later parts really get into the weeds analytically. If you're into that kind of thing, by all means. If you're not, just read parts of the book, and I'll be delighted.
The book is The Musical Language of Italian Opera, 1813 to 1859, published by Oxford University Press by Dr. William Rothstein. Professor Rothstein, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.